Welcome to Unknown Suspect, the channel where silence hides secrets and every detail matters. Join legendary detective Hercule Poirot as he unravels mysteries built on deception, logic, and the power of observation. Settle in, listen closely, and remember, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The Mystery of Ashcombe Grange. Chapter 1. A quiet house with sharp edges. Ashcombe Grange lay at the end of a long gravel drive, its pale stone facade softened by age and spring sunlight. To the casual visitor, it appeared calm, almost welcoming. Yet to Hercule Poirot, who stood for a moment before entering, the house gave off a different impression. There was a tightness about it, a sense of restraint, as though its walls were holding their breath. Poirot adjusted his hat, brushed an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, and rang the bell. The door was opened by a tall woman in a dark dress, her posture stiff and formal. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes flicked briefly past Poirot, back into the hallway, before she invited him inside. "This way, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "They are expecting you." Poirot followed her into a wide entrance hall where the air smelled faintly of furniture polish and cold stone. A grandfather clock ticked steadily against one wall, its sound unusually loud in the silence. Someone had attempted to restore order after a disturbance, Poirot thought, but order restored too quickly often concealed disorder beneath. In the drawing room, 3 figures awaited him. Margaret Ashcombe, Sir Lionel's daughter, rose at once. She was a woman in her early 30s, dressed plainly but elegantly, her dark hair neatly pinned back. Her expression was solemn, her hands clasped tightly together. "My father admired your work, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "We are grateful you agreed to come." Poirot bowed slightly. "I am sorry that the circumstances are so triste, Mademoiselle." Beside her stood Edward Hale, Sir Lionel's stepson. He was younger than Margaret, restless in manner, his fingers tapping lightly against the arm of his chair. His eyes avoided Poirot's, though he forced a polite smile. Seated slightly apart was Miss Clara Winthrop, Sir Lionel's secretary. She remained still as Poirot entered, observing him with measured interest. Her face was calm, her clothing practical, her manner precise. Poirot noticed at once that she did not fidget, nor did she look away. 3 people, Poirot reflected, 3 different silences. After brief introductions, Margaret gestured toward a chair. Poirot sat, placing his hat neatly beside him. "You have been told," Margaret began, "that my father's death was ruled an accident. He fell from the library balcony late in the evening." "Yes," Poirot replied gently. "But accidents that summon detectives are rarely content to remain accidents." Edward shifted in his seat. "The police found no sign of a struggle," he said quickly. "Sir Lionel was tired. He had been working late." Poirot smiled faintly but did not respond. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Hawthorne. "Madame, would you be so kind as to show me the library?" The housekeeper hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course." The library lay at the rear of the house, its tall windows opening onto a small stone balcony that overlooked the gardens. Afternoon light filtered in, casting long shadows across the shelves. Poirot entered slowly, his eyes moving with careful precision. He noted the arrangement of books, the polished desk, the leather chair placed near the balcony rail. Everything was neat, too neat. "This," Mrs. Hawthorne said quietly, "is where Sir Lionel fell." Poirot stepped closer to the balcony. The rail was sturdy, well maintained. He leaned slightly over it, calculating angles and distances. A fall was possible, certainly, but it would require carelessness of a particular sort. On the floor near the French doors lay a heavy ledger. Poirot crouched, examining it closely. The spine was unmarked. No dust clung to its edges. "This book," Poirot murmured, "was meant to explain the fall." Mrs. Hawthorne frowned. "I don't understand." Poirot stood, smoothing his jacket. "If Sir Lionel had tripped over it," he said, "it would show the story of that clumsiness. Instead, it tells me another story entirely." He turned his attention to the desk. Papers were stacked with unnatural precision. Sir Lionel, Poirot had learned, was not a tidy man. Yet here, everything aligned perfectly. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell me," he asked, "who last saw Sir Lionel alive?" Mrs. Hawthorne replied at once. "Miss Winthrop delivered some papers to him that evening." Poirot thanked her and returned to the drawing room, where the others waited with thinly veiled anxiety. "Miss Winthrop," he said, "you were with Sir Lionel shortly before his death?" "Yes," she replied evenly. "He requested a document. I brought it, nothing more." Poirot inclined his head. "And you noticed nothing unusual?" "Nothing," she said. Her tone was calm, almost too calm. Poirot shifted his gaze to Edward. "You were not in the house at the time, I believe?" Edward nodded quickly. "I was walking in the gardens. I needed air." "And you, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked Margaret. "I had retired early," she said. "I was unwell." Poirot accepted each answer without comment. Instead, he folded his hands together, his expression thoughtful. "You see," he said softly, "what troubles me is not what you tell me, but how neatly it all fits. Life is rarely so obliging." The room grew very quiet. Poirot rose, retrieving his hat. "For now," he continued, "I will ask no more questions, but be assured of this. Ashcombe Grange is a house that speaks, and very soon it will tell me exactly how Sir Lionel Ashcombe met his end." As he left the room, the ticking of the clock seemed louder than before, marking not the passage of time, but the beginning of truth. Chapter 2. The Shape of Motives. Hercule Poirot believed firmly that motives revealed themselves long before guilt. Facts could be altered, evidence misplaced, but the human heart, that was far less disciplined. With this principle guiding him, Poirot devoted the following morning not to the library, but to the people of Ashcombe Grange. Breakfast was served in a long, sunlit room overlooking the gardens. The table was set with careful symmetry, yet the atmosphere remained strained. Conversation faltered almost at once, leaving only the faint clink of china and the soft shuffle of servants' footsteps. Poirot observed in silence. Margaret Ashcombe sat upright, her hands resting lightly beside her plate. She ate very little, though she made a visible effort to appear composed. Edward Hale, by contrast, consumed his breakfast quickly and without pleasure, glancing repeatedly toward the windows as though eager to escape the room. Miss Winthrop arrived last, punctual but unobtrusive, offering a brief nod before taking her seat. Poirot sipped his coffee and waited. Eventually, Edward pushed his chair back with unnecessary force. "I'm going out," he said abruptly. "I can't sit in this house all day." Margaret looked up. "Edward, please." He waved her off and left the room. Poirot's eyes followed him thoughtfully. "Ah," he murmured, "movement, always interesting." After breakfast, Poirot requested individual conversations. He began with Margaret. They sat in a small morning room, its pale curtains stirring gently in the breeze. Margaret clasped her hands in her lap, her posture careful, her expression restrained. "You loved your father," Poirot said quietly. "Yes," she replied at once. "He was not an easy man, but he was kind in his way." "And yet," Poirot continued, "you disagreed with him recently." Margaret hesitated. "He was controlling. He wished to dictate my future, but we reconciled." Poirot nodded. Naturally. He watched her closely as he spoke of the will. Her expression flickered, only slightly, but enough. "You were to inherit Ashcombe Grange," Poirot said. "Yes." "And that was a recent change?" She inhaled slowly. "My father believed the house should remain in the family." "A generous sentiment," Poirot replied. "One that does not always inspire generosity in others." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "If you are suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Poirot interrupted gently. "I observe." When she left, Poirot remained seated for a moment, reflecting. Margaret's grief was genuine, but grief did not preclude relief. He had seen that many times before. Edward Hale arrived next, his manner restless, his voice edged with irritation. "You think it was murder?" Edward said bluntly. "Everyone does." Poirot inclined his head. "I think it is unwise to think too quickly." Edward laughed harshly. "My stepfather enjoyed making enemies, especially in his own house." "And you?" Poirot asked softly. "Did you enjoy being here?" Edward looked away. "He controlled everything, even my allowance." "And this caused resentment?" "Of course it did," Edward snapped. Then, catching himself, he added, "But resentment isn't murder." Poirot watched Edward's fingers tapping against the chair arm, faster now. "You were in the garden at the time of the fall," Poirot said. "Did you see or hear anything unusual?" "No." "And the lights in the library?" Edward hesitated. "I think they were on." Poirot made a mental note. "Think," he repeated silently. "Or no." Finally, Poirot spoke with Miss Winthrop. She met him in Sir Lionel's study, standing beside the desk as though guarding it. Her posture was calm, her expression attentive. "You were Sir Lionel's secretary for many years," Poirot said. "7, she replied. "I managed his correspondence, finances, and appointments. A position of trust." "Yes." Poirot picked up a letter opener from the desk, examining it briefly before setting it down. "Sir Lionel was not an orderly man," he remarked. "Yet this desk is very tidy." Miss Winthrop smiled faintly. "I tidied it every evening." "Even on the night of his death?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes met hers. "Even after his fall?" She did not answer at once. Then carefully, "I believed it was appropriate." Poirot thanked her and withdrew. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested to see Sir Lionel's will. It was produced promptly, already copied and sealed. The document was straightforward enough, yet Poirot noticed something peculiar. The language suggested recent revision, but the ink appeared uniform throughout. Someone had been thorough. Poirot asked Mrs. Hawthorne about the household routine. She described it carefully, though her voice trembled when she spoke of that evening. There was a raised voice, she admitted. "In the library." "Which voice?" Poirot asked. "I could not say." "But you heard anger?" "Yes." Anger, Poirot reflected, was a fine red herring. It distracted from fear, which was far more dangerous. As evening fell, Poirot returned once more to the library. He stood by the balcony, replaying events in his mind, not as facts, but as intentions. Sir Lionel had not simply fallen, he had been persuaded to stand there. Persuasion required familiarity. Poirot glanced at the desk again. Something was missing. Not an object, but a disruption. A letter, perhaps, a document capable of altering relationships. He smiled faintly. "The motive," Poirot murmured, "is not money alone. It is position, security, control." Outside, the light faded, casting the room into shadow. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. Poirot straightened his tie. Ashcombe Grange, he knew now, was not a house divided by hatred, but by quiet, careful ambition. And ambition, when threatened, was capable of remarkable precision. The shape of the crime was becoming clearer. The hand that committed it, however, remained just beyond sight. Chapter 3. A convenient witness. The morning dawned grey and unsettled, a thin mist clinging to the gardens of Ashcombe Grange. Hercule Poirot stood at one of the tall windows, hands clasped behind his back, watching droplets gather and slide down the glass. Weather, he reflected, had a way of mirroring the human spirit, never quite as calm as it pretended to be. Behind him, the house stirred slowly to life. Poirot had asked that no one leave the property that morning. It was a request made politely, yet it carried a firmness that discouraged objection. There was still much to be understood, and movement, Poirot knew, often muddied the waters. His first concern that day was Edward Hale's alibi. Edward claimed he had been walking in the gardens at the time of Sir Lionel's death. A simple explanation, a reasonable one, and therefore, Poirot thought, deserving of careful inspection. The gardens stretched behind the house in long formal lines, trimmed hedges, gravel paths, and a small ornamental pond bordered by stone. They were not extensive, but they offered privacy in certain corners, particularly near the old yew trees at the far end. Poirot walked the path slowly, noting the angles between the garden and the library balcony. From most positions, the balcony was partially obscured by foliage. "Visibility," Poirot murmured, "is a jealous thing. It does not share itself easily." He was joined shortly by Thomas Reed, the gardener, a broad-shouldered man with rough hands and a nervous manner. Reed removed his cap when he saw Poirot, shifting his weight uneasily. "You saw Mr. Hale that night?" Poirot asked. "Yes, sir. Or, well, I believe I did." Poirot smiled gently. "Belief is not quite the same as certainty, my friend." Reed frowned. "He was on the lower path, near the yews, said he needed air." "At what time?" Reed hesitated. "It was dark. Perhaps just after 9. Poirot nodded, though his eyes sharpened slightly. "You are sure of the hour?" Reed scratched his head. "Not exactly, sir. I judge by the lamps." Poirot thanked him and continued on alone. The lamps, he noted, were timed. They did not illuminate the garden until later than 9. A small detail, but small details were the foundation of truth. Back inside, Poirot found Edward in the billiard room, pacing. He stopped abruptly when Poirot entered. "You've been questioning the staff," Edward said. It was not a question. "I ask questions," Poirot replied calmly. "Answers are optional." Edward forced a laugh. "You think I lied?" "I think," Poirot said, "that you told the story most useful to you." Edward's jaw tightened. "I argued with Sir Lionel, yes. I won't deny it. But I didn't kill him." Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "Tell me about the argument." Edward ran a hand through his hair. "Money? Control?" He reduced my allowance again. "Said I lacked discipline?" "And this made you angry?" "Yes." "Angry enough to push him from a balcony?" Edward stared at Poirot, then shook his head sharply. "No!" Poirot noticed the tapping fingers again, faster now, more erratic. "You left the house," Poirot said. "Why?" Edward hesitated. "I needed air. The walls felt close." Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, claustrophobia. Or perhaps escape." Edward flushed. "You twist everything." Poirot smiled faintly. "I untangle." Later that afternoon, Poirot spoke once more with Margaret Ashcombe. She was in the small sitting room, a book open on her lap, though she was not reading. "Edward's behaviour troubles you?" Poirot observed. "He has always been impulsive," Margaret said carefully. "My father worried about him." "And you?" "I worried about my father." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "On the night of his death, did you hear anything unusual?" Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "I heard voices, raised voices." "From the library?" Yes. Did you recognize them? No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Poirot noted it, but did not press further. Instead, he asked a different question. Did your father fear anyone in this house? Margaret looked startled. Fear? No, he was not afraid. Poirot nodded. Fear, he reflected, often wore the mask of authority until it was too late. That evening, Poirot requested access to the household logs, maintenance notes, deliveries, schedules. Such documents rarely lied, though they often revealed more than intended. One entry caught his attention, a request made by Miss Winthrop for additional lamp oil earlier that week. An ordinary request, except that the lamps near the garden path had not been used recently. Poirot tapped the page thoughtfully. If Edward had truly been in the garden, the light would matter. If not, then the witness had seen what he expected to see, not what was there. Poirot returned once more to the library at dusk. The fading light softened the room, disguising its sharper angles. He stood where Sir Lionel had stood, near the balcony rail. From here, the garden path was barely visible. Poirot allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. A convenient witness, he murmured, and a convenient absence. Edward's alibi was weakening, but Poirot knew better than to leap to conclusions. A broken alibi did not make a murderer. It merely removed a shield. As the house settled into silence for the night, Poirot retreated to his room. He arranged his belongings with care, aligning his shoes precisely, smoothing the bedspread. Order, he reflected, comforted some and obsessed others. Outside, the mist thickened, blurring the edges of the garden paths. Somewhere within Ashcombe Grange, someone slept poorly, aware perhaps that a story once told with confidence was beginning to unravel. And Poirot, his little grey cells quietly at work, knew that the truth had taken its first step out of shadow. Chapter 4. The Misplaced Book. Hercule Poirot had always maintained that objects, unlike people, did not lie. They could be moved, disguised, even planted with intent, but they never acted of their own accord. If one listened carefully enough, they told the story of the hand that placed them. It was with this belief that Poirot returned to the library early the following morning, before the house had fully awakened. Sunlight crept in through the tall windows, illuminating the balcony doors and casting pale stripes across the rug. The room looked peaceful, even dignified, an impression Poirot found deeply misleading. He went first to the balcony rail. The stone below showed no sign of disturbance now. Rain had washed it clean, but Poirot had already reconstructed the fall in his mind. He placed his hands lightly on the rail and leaned forward, gauging the height, the balance required, the effort it would take to lose one's footing accidentally. It would require, Poirot murmured, a very particular clumsiness. He stepped back and turned his attention to the chair positioned near the rail. It stood at a slight angle, not aligned with the desk or the window, but facing the open space beyond. Poirot crouched, eye level with the chair legs. "One does not sit here to read," he said softly. "One stands." He measured the distance between the chair and the balcony. Too far for a stumble, too precise for chance. Poirot straightened and crossed to the bookcase, scanning the shelves. Sir Lionel had favoured ledgers, business records, correspondence, heavy volumes rarely removed without purpose. His gaze returned to the book lying on the floor, near the French doors. The ledger. Poirot picked it up carefully. It was heavier than expected, its leather cover uncreased, its pages pristine. No corner was bent. No spine bore the mark of impact. Poirot smiled faintly. "If you had tripped," he said quietly, "you would have taken the book with you, but you did not." He replaced the ledger on the desk and examined the carpet beneath where it had supposedly fallen. The fibres were undisturbed. Someone had placed the book there. Afterwards, Poirot stepped back and surveyed the room as a whole. Everything was arranged to suggest a single narrative. Sir Lionel had worked late, grown careless, tripped and fallen. It was a neat story. Too neat. Neatness, Poirot reflected, was often the enemy of truth. He rang the bell for Mrs. Hawthorne. When she arrived, Poirot gestured toward the ledger. "Was this book usually kept here?" "No, monsieur," she said at once. "It belongs on the third shelf." "And did you move it?" "No." "Did you see it fall?" She shook her head. "No, sir. It was like that when we found him." Poirot nodded. "Thank you." After she left, Poirot examined the desk more closely. He opened drawers, noting the careful organization, far more precise than Sir Lionel's habit suggested. Something was missing, not a thing easily named, but a disruption. A break in pattern. Poirot knew instinctively that a document had been removed. A letter, perhaps? He closed the drawers and stood very still. That afternoon, Poirot asked to see Miss Winthrop. She entered the library with quiet efficiency, her expression composed. "You tidy this room every evening?" Poirot said. "Yes." "Even on the night of Sir Lionel's death?" "Yes." Poirot gestured gently toward the desk. "You did so after the fall?" She paused. "Yes, I believed it appropriate." Poirot nodded. "Tell me, mademoiselle, when you tidied the desk that evening, was everything already in order?" Miss Winthrop hesitated, only briefly, but long enough. "It was, mostly so," she said. "Mostly?" Poirot repeated. She met his gaze. Sir Lionel had completed his work. Poirot smiled pleasantly, though his eyes remained sharp. "I see." After she left, Poirot remained in the library, turning her words over in his mind. Sir Lionel had not been a man to complete his work neatly. He left papers unfinished, letters half-read. Someone else had completed the scene. Later, Poirot spoke with Edward again, this time casually, as they walked the corridor outside the library. "You were angry with Sir Lionel," Poirot said. "Yes." "But anger alone does not arrange furniture so carefully," Poirot continued. Edward scoffed. "You think I staged the room?" "I think," Poirot said mildly, "that staging requires patience." Edward stopped walking. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot shook his head. "I am eliminating." That evening, Poirot requested the household to gather briefly in the drawing room. "I will not accuse anyone tonight," he said calmly. "But I will say this. Sir Lionel's death was not an accident, and the room in which he died was altered." There was a collective intake of breath. Margaret looked shaken. Edward's face darkened. Miss Winthrop remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Poirot watched them carefully. Fear revealed itself in many ways: denial, anger, silence. As the gathering dispersed, Poirot returned once more to the library. He stood alone in the quiet, listening to the faint ticking of the clock down the corridor. The ledger, the chair, the desk. Each spoke of intention. The crime, Poirot murmured, was committed not in haste, but in control. And that, he knew, narrowed the field considerably. Somewhere in Ashcombe Grange, the person who had placed the book, adjusted the chair, and removed the missing letter, now understood that the stage they had built so carefully was beginning to collapse. Poirot turned out the light and closed the door softly behind him. The truth, like the house itself, was patient, but it was awake now. Chapter 5. Truth in Small Habits. Hercule Poirot had learned long ago that guilt did not always announce itself with trembling hands or raised voices. More often, it revealed itself in habits so small they escaped notice until one knew how to look. On the 5th day, at Ashcombe Grange, Poirot altered his routine. Instead of requesting interviews, he simply observed. He positioned himself in shared spaces, the hall after breakfast, the corridor outside the study, the garden terrace in the late afternoon. He spoke little, listened much, and allowed the household to forget, just briefly, that it was being examined. It was during these moments that the truth began to loosen its grip. Margaret Ashcombe passed Poirot in the hallway mid-morning. She greeted him politely, her voice steady, yet her hands moved at once to straighten the cuffs of her sleeves, though they required no adjustment. She did this every time Poirot approached unexpectedly. A nervous habit, Poirot thought, not of fear, but of restraint. Later, Edward Hale emerged from the dining room, clearly irritated. He muttered to himself as he walked, stopping abruptly when he realized Poirot stood nearby. At once, Edward forced a smile and asked an unnecessary question about the weather. Edward, Poirot reflected, spoke most when he wished to hide his thoughts. Miss Winthrop, by contrast, rarely spoke without purpose. When she did, it was to correct a detail politely, precisely, and only when accuracy mattered. She noticed errors others ignored. Order mattered to her. That afternoon, Poirot requested the household timetable, not the official one, but the informal rhythm of the house. When did people rise? Where did they spend the hour before dinner? Who habitually moved through the back corridors instead of the main hall? Mrs. Hawthorne answered carefully. Miss Winthrop often works late, she said. She prefers the study after supper. And Sir Lionel? Poirot asked. He used the library. Poirot nodded. Two routines overlapping regularly. Familiarity bred access. Poirot then asked an unusual question. Does anyone here dislike disorder? Mrs. Hawthorne looked puzzled. Dislike it? Yes, actively. She thought for a moment. Miss Winthrop, perhaps. She cannot abide untidiness. Poirot smiled faintly. That evening, Poirot conducted a small experiment. He moved a vase in the corridor, only slightly, just enough to disrupt its symmetry. He left a book on a side table at a crooked angle. He folded a newspaper imperfectly and placed it on the arm of a chair. Then he waited. By the next morning, all three had been corrected. Someone had straightened them during the night. Poirot was not surprised. He requested tea in the study and invited Miss Winthrop to join him. She arrived promptly. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, you take pride in efficiency. Yes. And precision? Of course. Poirot nodded. Tell me, do you find it difficult to sleep when things are unfinished? Miss Winthrop considered. I prefer matters resolved. Even small ones? Poirot asked. She met his gaze. Especially small ones. Poirot leaned back slightly. Sir Lionel planned changes shortly before his death. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes tightened. He was always planning, she said. Yes, Poirot replied. But this time the plans concerned you. She said nothing. Poirot did not press. Silence, he knew, often encouraged revelation more effectively than interrogation. The next day, Poirot turned his attention to the household accounts. Sir Lionel's finances were extensive, but clear. Yet one detail stood out, a draft letter referenced in the ledger index, but missing from the files. Poirot noted the reference number. The letter had been logged, which meant it had existed, and which meant someone had ensured it no longer did. Poirot requested access to the waste records, ashes from the fireplaces, disposal logs, cleaning schedules. Mrs. Hawthorne produced them reluctantly. One entry caught Poirot's attention. The library fireplace had been cleaned thoroughly the morning after Sir Lionel's death, though it had not been used the previous evening. Poirot closed the book slowly. Destruction of paper was not always dramatic. Often it was methodical. That afternoon, Poirot encountered Margaret in the garden. "You are leaving soon?" she said quietly. "Yes," Poirot replied. "When the story is complete." She hesitated. "Do you know what happened to my father?" Poirot studied her carefully. "I know," he said, "that someone feared change more than consequences." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Poirot watched her walk away. Fear of change, he reflected, took many forms. For Edward, it was resentment. For Margaret, uncertainty. For another, fear of losing position, identity, control. That night, Poirot sat alone in his room, reviewing his notes. The crime had not been spontaneous. It required timing, privacy, and confidence. It required someone who understood Sir Lionel's habits, anticipated his reactions, and possessed the composure to arrange the aftermath. It also required someone who believed, truly believed, that order justified action. Poirot closed his notebook. "The truth," he murmured, "is not loud. It repeats itself quietly, in habit, in correction, in routine." Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed softly. Someone, Poirot knew, was still tidying loose ends. And that meant the end was approaching. Chapter 6. The red herring, removed. Hercule Poirot disliked haste. Conclusions reached too quickly often rested on assumptions rather than understanding. And yet, there came a moment in every investigation when one path had to be closed firmly, lest it distract from the truth. That moment arrived on the 6th morning at Ashcombe Grange. Poirot requested Edward Hale's presence in the small study overlooking the side lawn. The room was modest, almost severe, and offered no distractions. Edward entered with visible reluctance, his expression already defensive. "You have decided, then," Edward said, folding his arms, "that I am your murderer." Poirot gestured calmly toward a chair. "Sit, I beg of you. Drama clouds the little grey cells." Edward sat but did not relax. "You have been honest about your anger," Poirot continued. "That is to your credit, but honesty is not the same as guilt." Edward snorted. "You've made it very clear I look convenient." "Convenient suspects," Poirot replied gently, "are rarely correct ones." Poirot opened a small notebook. "You told me you were in the garden on the night Sir Lionel died. That statement is false." Edward stiffened. But, Poirot raised a finger, "a false statement does not equal murder, it equals fear." Edward looked away. "I didn't want to be blamed. We had argued." "Just so," Poirot said. "You left the house but not into the garden. You walked down the drive." Edward's head snapped up. "How could you know that?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Your shoes. The dust on them was from the drive, not the garden paths. You returned later, after the fall." Edward exhaled sharply. "I panicked." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "you panicked. But panic does not push a man from a balcony and then rearrange a room." Edward's shoulders slumped. "I didn't kill him." Poirot closed the notebook. "No, you did not." Edward stared at him. "Then why all this?" "Because," Poirot said quietly, "someone wished very much for you to appear guilty." Edward frowned. "Who?" Poirot stood. "That is what remains." Later that morning, Poirot asked Margaret Ashcombe to walk with him. They followed a path along the edge of the grounds, the air crisp and unsettled. "You have protected Edward," Poirot said suddenly. Margaret stopped. "He's family." "You discouraged the staff from speaking freely," Poirot continued. "You downplayed the argument." "Why?" Margaret's voice trembled slightly. "Because Edward is reckless. I feared he would destroy himself." Poirot nodded. "And yet you did not commit the crime to save him." She looked at him sharply. "You're certain?" "Yes," Poirot replied. "Your actions after your father's death were reactive, not calculated. You sought stability, not control. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I loved my father, but he frightened me too. Poirot inclined his head. Fear is not evidence of murder. That afternoon, Poirot assembled the household once more. I will be very clear, he said calmly. Edward Hale is no longer under suspicion. Edward looked stunned. Mrs. Hawthorne gasped softly. Miss Winthrop remained motionless. Poirot observed her closely. To accuse without certainty is unjust, Poirot continued, and injustice creates noise. I prefer silence. It allows the truth to speak. Afterwards, Poirot returned to the library alone. Now that Edward was removed from the equation, several details sharpened. The staged scene, the removed document, the precise restoration of order, all required time after the death. Edward had been absent. Margaret had been distraught. Only one person had both presence and composure. Poirot moved to the desk and opened the ledger again. This time, he examined the margins carefully. A faint indentation caught his eye, impressions left by writing on a removed page. Poirot traced the marks with his finger. A letter, he murmured, written with conviction. The pressure was firm, not hurried. The writer had believed deeply in the words. Poirot imagined the moment, Sir Lionel reading, reacting, perhaps dismissing the concern. A confrontation, not explosive, but sharp. A decisive movement. And then silence. That evening, Poirot spoke briefly with Miss Winthrop in the corridor. You are relieved, he observed, that Mr. Hale is no longer suspected. It is only just, she replied calmly. Justice, Poirot said, is often mistaken for balance, but balance is merely comfort. She regarded him coolly. Are you suggesting something else? I suggest nothing, Poirot replied. I arrange. That night, Poirot reviewed every statement again, not for contradictions, but for consistency. The killer, he knew, would be the most consistent of all. And there it was. Miss Winthrop had never once described Sir Lionel emotionally, only functionally. He was a role, a position, a system. When that system threatened to change, she acted. Poirot closed his notebook. The red herring, he murmured, has served its purpose. With Edward cleared, the mystery no longer sprawled. It narrowed. The truth, Poirot knew, was now standing directly behind him. He smiled slightly. Only 2 chapters remained. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Order. Hercule Poirot awoke early the next morning, as was his habit, long before the household stirred. He dressed meticulously, each item of clothing aligned perfectly, as though preparing himself not only for the day, but for the exactitude required by the investigation. Breakfast was sparse, a small coffee, a slice of bread, and a carefully spread marmalade. Even in the quiet of his room, Poirot's mind was already moving, assembling threads that the others could not yet see. The mist had lifted, but the air remained cool, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and cut grass. From the window, Poirot observed the grounds. The paths, neat and trimmed, reflected the order within the house. Yet it was a deceptive order, one carefully maintained to hide its underlying tension. Poirot left his room and moved quietly down the corridor, pausing at intervals to observe the household. The servants moved with diligence, but it was the family and Miss Winthrop who commanded his attention. Every gesture, every small motion told him more than words ever could. Margaret Ashcombe appeared first, carrying a bundle of letters from the morning post. She walked with a careful, measured step, pausing to glance out the window before placing the letters neatly on a side table. Her hands lingered over the stack for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting the arrangement with almost imperceptible precision. Poirot noted the habit, recognizing it not as mere refinement, but as an unconscious need to impose order on a world that had momentarily slipped from her control. Edward Hale followed shortly afterward, his impatience now evident. He drummed his fingers against the rail of the staircase, glanced repeatedly toward the windows, and muttered under his breath. There was restlessness in his every movement, an outward expression of inner tension. Yet, Poirot observed, it was also transparent. It carried no subtlety. Edward's thoughts, unlike Margaret's, were easily read like an open book. This made him less threatening and, in Poirot's mind, increasingly irrelevant to the puzzle at hand. Miss Winthrop appeared last, entering the room with an air of quiet assurance. She carried herself with calm efficiency, moving straight to the desk and checking the arrangement of papers and objects. Poirot watched her from across the room, noting how she straightened a misaligned letter without hesitation, then adjusted the position of the inkwell. The actions were small yet deliberate, habitual and revealing. Miss Winthrop's order was precise, and it was enforced. Where Edward's nervous energy betrayed impulsiveness and Margaret's care revealed concern, Miss Winthrop's movements were governed by necessity and principle. Poirot made no immediate comment. Instead, he observed, allowing patterns to emerge. For hours, he moved among the household as a shadow, quietly taking note of every gesture and every glance. The subtle variations in posture, tone and attention were, to Poirot, far more illuminating than any spoken word. By midday, he gathered the household in the drawing room, the same space where discussions of the incident had first taken place. Poirot's presence commanded attention without demanding it. He did not raise his voice, nor did he accuse. He spoke softly, deliberately, almost conversationally, yet every sentence contained weight. "My friends," he began, "it is remarkable how humans reveal themselves without meaning to. Each gesture, each habit, tells a story. One need only know how to read it." Margaret shifted in her seat. Edward frowned. Miss Winthrop remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed politely on Poirot. "Consider the room in which Sir Lionel met his unfortunate end," Poirot continued. "The chair, the ledger, the arrangement of the desk, all meticulously placed. It was a scene intended to deceive, yes, but also to conceal the truth." He paused, letting the words sink in. The household was silent. Even the clock seemed to tick more softly in anticipation. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "Accidents," he said slowly, "are messy. Disorder follows naturally. But here, order followed the accident. Someone sought to erase the chaos that might reveal their hand." Margaret's fingers tightened around her napkin. Edward's jaw stiffened. Miss Winthrop remained impassive, though Poirot caught a faint tightening of her lips. Subtle, nearly imperceptible, but enough. "This," Poirot continued, "requires reflection, precision, the ability to anticipate others' reactions, the patience to wait, observe, and correct." He looked directly at Miss Winthrop, though not accusingly. "It also requires a profound respect for order itself, the type of respect that guides actions even when fear is present." The silence was complete. Poirot allowed it to linger, letting the weight of his observations settle upon each of them. Each person had now been forced to confront not what Poirot said directly, but what he implied. Guilt, fear, and habit all were reflected differently in each face. After a pause, Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing at the distant tree line. "Consider fear," he said softly. "It does not always roar. Often it whispers. It guides action in subtle ways, invisible to those who do not pay attention. And sometimes it is fear that motivates the most careful and deliberate acts." He turned slowly, eyes sweeping the room. "I have observed everyone here closely. Each has their habits. Each has their fears. Some are evident, some hidden. And it is in those hidden corners that truth resides." Poirot's gaze lingered on Miss Winthrop for a moment longer than usual. Her calm efficiency, her controlled movements, her exacting attention to detail. These were not mere quirks of personality. They were clues. Small habits, yes, but habits that guided her responses and revealed her understanding of the household's rhythms. They hinted at a mind capable of meticulous planning, of careful orchestration, of subtle manipulation. After another pause, Poirot concluded, "Tomorrow I shall return to the library. There, the objects themselves will speak more plainly, and then the path forward will become evident." The household dispersed quietly, each lost in thought. Margaret returned to her letters, rearranging them yet again. Edward moved restlessly to the terrace, pacing as he stared into the distance. Miss Winthrop returned to her desk, straightening every paper and adjusting the inkwell with a calm, deliberate motion. Poirot remained alone for a few moments longer, noting the patterns, storing them carefully in his mind. Every gesture, every small habit was a thread in the tapestry of truth. And he knew with the certainty that only experience could provide that the hand which had guided those threads would soon be revealed. As the evening light waned, Poirot finally retired to his room. He methodically prepared his clothing for the following day, arranged his notes, and reviewed the observations he had made over the previous hours. Every movement in Ashcombe Grange, he reflected, carried significance. Every habitual gesture, every careful adjustment, was a statement waiting to be interpreted. And Poirot, as always, was listening. Outside, the house settled into silence, but the air was thick with anticipation. Somewhere within Ashcombe Grange, the truth waited patiently, bound by the routines and the habits of those who dwelt there. The stage was set. The players had revealed themselves, and Poirot's little grey cells were ready to see the final act unfold. Chapter 8. The Little Grey Cells. Speak! Hercule Poirot had spent the entire morning reviewing his notes, methodically arranging his observations, and replaying the sequence of events in his mind. The house was quiet, too quiet, he noted, as though every occupant waited, aware on some unconscious level that the final reckoning was near. Poirot's little grey cells had worked steadily, quietly, like a clockwork mechanism, and now the pattern was clear. Only one person in Ashcombe Grange could have committed the act that claimed Sir Lionel's life. He requested the household to gather in the drawing-room once more. The servants moved silently, glancing at one another with apprehension. Margaret Ashcombe, pale but composed, seated herself near the window. Edward Hale, still restless but relieved that suspicion had been removed from his shoulders, stood near the fireplace. Miss Winthrop arrived last, carrying herself with her usual calm efficiency. She bowed slightly and took her seat. Poirot surveyed the room, his gaze moving carefully from face to face. "Mes amis," he began, "we have reached the moment where we must speak openly. For several days I have observed this household, not only the objects and documents, but the habits, gestures and silences of those within it." He paused. His eyes rested on Miss Winthrop. "And it is these habits, these small consistencies, that have revealed the truth. Sir Lionel Ashcombe's death was not an accident." No one spoke. The air was tense, filled with quiet anticipation. Poirot continued, "Let us begin with the facts. Sir Lionel was found at the foot of the library balcony. The ledger lay nearby, the chair stood at an angle, the desk perfectly arranged. All of these details were intended to suggest an accidental fall." He walked to the desk and ran a finger along its polished surface. Yet an accident, monsieur and mesdames, is never so tidy. Papers are displaced, objects topple. Here, the ledger was too carefully placed. The chair was intentionally angled. And the missing letter, Poirot held up a small, blank sheet he had recovered from the fireplace ashes, was deliberately removed. Margaret's lips parted slightly as though to speak, but she hesitated. Edward's fingers drummed against the chair arm. Miss Winthrop remained composed. Poirot continued, "One must ask, who had both the opportunity and the composure to commit such an act? Who understood Sir Lionel's habits, anticipated his reactions, and possessed the patience to stage the scene convincingly?" His gaze returned to Miss Winthrop. "Mademoiselle, you were present in the house during every critical moment. You delivered papers to Sir Lionel, you had unrestricted access to his study, and you alone restored the room afterward, aligning objects with meticulous precision." Miss Winthrop's hands, folded neatly in her lap, twitched imperceptibly. Poirot observed. "You see," he said, "the key to this crime is not force, nor rage. It is order. The murderer values control more than anger, efficiency more than impulse. Fear may have prompted the act, but calculation guided its execution." He moved to the window, looking out at the gardens bathed in pale afternoon light. "Sir Lionel planned to dismiss you, Mademoiselle Winthrop? You discovered this intention and feared the consequences, not just of losing your position, but of the chaos it would introduce. That letter, the one I recovered from the fireplace, proved the plan." Poirot returned to the center of the room. "You confronted him, and in a moment of panic and careful deliberation, you pushed him. The fall was not violent, it was precise. Then you arranged the room to disguise the act, placed the ledger and angled the chair, and removed the letter to prevent discovery." Miss Winthrop's expression did not change, though her eyes flickered slightly. "Monsieur Poirot," she said evenly, "you are mistaken." Poirot shook his head gently. "Ah, no, I am not. Observe the evidence carefully. The ledger's spine is uncreased, indicating it was placed after the fall. The chair stands in deliberate alignment. The dust and polish patterns on the desk reveal careful handling, consistent with your habits. And finally, the letter's impressions on the ledger page show the pressure of a deliberate hand." Edward's jaw tightened. "So all this time, it was you?" Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, Edward, it is always those who blend precision with opportunity who are most dangerous. Passion alone rarely succeeds in masking guilt so elegantly." Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Miss Winthrop's hands shifted, fingers brushing the edge of the desk. Margaret's face remained pale, but her composure returned, as though relief and horror mingled in equal measure. Edward exhaled sharply, disbelief giving way to understanding. "Consider also," Poirot continued, "the subtle habits that revealed the murderer. Margaret's anxiety, Edward's restlessness, and your insistence on order, Miss Winthrop, all these behaviors spoke of character. But only one person combined access, composure, and the obsessive need to maintain control. That is why the red herrings, the arguments, Edward's alibi, Margaret's grief, were so misleading. They distracted attention, but they could not hide the truth from careful observation." Miss Winthrop finally spoke, her voice steady but quiet. "You have observed well, Monsieur Poirot, but you cannot prove intent." Poirot smiled faintly, his small moustache twitching. "Ah, but the little grey cells do not require confession to see intent. The truth lies in the actions themselves. Every habit, every gesture, every meticulous correction tells a story that cannot be erased." He walked slowly toward the fireplace, gesturing toward the ashes. "This," he said, is where the letter once lay. It was destroyed to remove evidence, but not before it revealed pressure marks on the ledger. These impressions confirm not only the existence of the letter, but also its author. Precision, care, order, these traits are unmistakable. Poirot's gaze returned to Miss Winthrop. You acted not out of hatred, but out of fear and calculation. You valued the house, its order, and your own security above all else, and so you committed the act with meticulous care. For the first time, a subtle tremor appeared in Miss Winthrop's composure. Her hands tightened on the edge of her chair. Poirot continued gently, as if speaking to someone he respected rather than accusing. You feared change, mademoiselle, and so you created a scene of your own making. And yet, despite your care, the little grey cells see all. The accident you staged was not perfect. Small habits that you could not suppress, betrayed the truth. There was silence. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Edward's expression was a mix of relief and astonishment. Miss Winthrop's lips parted slightly, and for a brief moment the mask slipped. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Yes, she said softly. It is true. Poirot inclined his head. Then justice may proceed with clarity. The house, its objects, and its routines have all spoken. You acted with precision, but the truth, as always, has prevailed. He turned to the others. Remember this. The greatest crimes are often the quietest, the most precise, the most human. Fear, calculation, and habit combine in ways that escape notice, until one pays attention. As he spoke, a sense of calm settled over the room. The mystery that had gripped Ashcombe Grange for days had been unravelled not by force, but by observation, reasoning, and an understanding of human nature. Poirot straightened his jacket, smoothing his tie with an almost imperceptible gesture of satisfaction. The little grey cells, he said softly, have triumphed once more. The household remained silent, contemplating both the revelation and the elegance with which it had been unveiled. Poirot's brilliance, his methodical reasoning, and his psychological insight had brought clarity to chaos. And though the events had been tragic, the resolution was complete. Order restored, truth revealed, and justice served. Poirot allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Ashcombe Grange, for all its grandeur and outward calm, had concealed human tension, ambition, and fear. And yet, as always, truth had a way of finding its voice, even in the most meticulously ordered house. He smiled faintly, his small moustache twitching with satisfaction. The case is closed, but the next mystery is already waiting. This is unknown suspect.